there's been some interesting aspects. I mean, it's a huge issue, obviously, the war in Ukraine. We want to look at the economic impact because there's been some interesting reports this week that Putin is now demanding that his gas being paid with rubles. And that is quite interesting, obviously. And I'm just reading out a quote. And it shows, I think it shows really how capitalism, it carries on functioning, very well in an international level, global capitalism, despite this huge war. He's basically saying, what's actually happening here? We've supplied European consumers with our resources, in this case, gas. They received it, paid us in euros, which they then froze. And in this regard, there's every reason to believe that we delivered part of the gas provided to Europe practically free of charge. Obviously, being paid in rubles, it has for him the advantage that it goes through. Can you shed some light on what's going on with this particular story?
Well, first, let's be on this particular point. Let's be aware that the gas and oil production and exports going into Western Europe, in particular Germany, is still going ahead, and that German buyers, corporations and others using this resource down the pipeline are still paying. They are paying this either in dollars or euros, and so the Russian oil and gas corporations are still receiving currencies. But the issue for them, of course, is they're getting it in euros and dollars, and they cannot spend that money on anything except domestically. Therefore, they have to convert it into rubles if they want to use it in any way. And they cannot possibly use it using the international banking service to bring about any sort of investments or activities that they want to do with those euros and dollars. So they're all frozen. So it's one thing to be paid the euros and dollars for the gas and oil exports. It's another thing to be able to use them in any sort of activity internationally. And they're not able to do that. And as we know, also, in addition to that, the most unprecedented development introduced by the NATO allies, in effect, or the rest of the G20 countries. Well, by the way, of the G20, only 8 G20 countries are following the sanctions. The rest are not following the sanctions. So next, in a couple of weeks' time, G20 meets, and this is going to be an interesting discussion because half the G20 governments are not supporting the sanctions. Admittedly, they're not the big countries, and it's the G7 that matters. And the G7 is applying, driven by the United States, unprecedentedly, the position where the Central Bank of Russia cannot use its exchange reserves. It's got 600+ billion US dollars in reserves and other currencies, but it cannot apply that in any way to meet its obligations on debt and so on that companies and the government might have internationally. It's frozen. How's that frozen? It's frozen because most of those dollars are not held in Russia at all. They're held in other debts, US bonds and other various places around the world, and actually held in cash by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which it believes holds Russia's FX reserves. So the result is, of course, that the vast majority of this money is frozen and is not available. This is unprecedented that a G20 country the size of Russia should have its central bank reserves frozen. The only 2 other countries that have had this done to them are Venezuela and Iran. So that gives you an indication of North Korea doesn't have any FX reserves worth thinking about. But so you can see that this is a major activity of sanctions. But revenue is still coming in to Russia in terms of oil, gas revenues, but they cannot use this. So what the argument is that Putin or the government has said, well, we want you to pay us in rubles because the 2 things that will help us there, we could use rubles domestically to provide necessities for the population, but also it means it will strengthen the currency in international markets, and the currency had collapsed beforehand as a result of the measures and sanctions taken by the NATO governments against Russia, not only the reserves, but also the stopping of international banking trade through the so-called SWIFT messaging system and other sanctions against various banks. But so that the counter move by the Russians was to say, you've got to pay us in rubles from now on, and then we can use those rubles. That will help currency to increase. Actually, the currency has recovered, the ruble currency has recovered against others because they're still getting oil and gas revenues, and that the sanctions in that sense are not really destroying the oil and gas exports that the Russians have got. And the Russians have also introduced a central bank capital controls. I think it's a major measure that anybody who, if you were a socialist government, this is obviously not the case, fighting against imperialism, one of the measures you'd have certainly introduced immediately if a socialist government came to power in such a situation, not in a war, but in perhaps facing the attacks of an imperialist countries against you, would be capital controls, which means you don't allow the rich to spirit their money out of the country. You control the movement of capital flows, cash, and other international transactions through banking regulations and monitoring. So the Russians, having followed free market policies for the last 25 years under Putin and before, have now adopted an anti-free market policy of capital controls, and at the same time are demanding money in rubles for their exports. But that doesn't really change the situation within the Russian economy, which is in a dire state, because when you are cut off from the ability to use your funds that you have in reserve, and you have to rely upon what you're selling in gas and oil exports and be able to convert that into money that you could use in the economy, it's going to have and then everything is frozen, including your own capital controls, then the Russian economy is going to be seriously weakened. And I have to say that it's likely to decline by anything between 10 and 15% in real output terms during the rest of the next year if this war continues as it does at the moment. That's way huge drop. But remember, Ukraine is likely to drop by 30 or 40% in 1 year. So that's an indication of the dire situation for those two countries.
Can I just ask? I mean, the sanctions itself. I mean, we just said, for the oligarchs, for the Putin government, he seems the least affected of all, by the sanctions. I mean, if you look at internationally, what's happening is wheat prices are going through the roof, which will affect really the poorest of the poor. And perhaps the working class in Russia will also suffer much more than that particular layer that's supposed to be affected by sanctions.
Yeah, the elites in Russia, and for that matter in Ukraine, are not suffering at all. Most of them have spirited their money away already. If you want to take all the Russian elite, most of whom have been living in London for the last 20 years with golden passports, thanks to the government, these people have got their money nicely spirited away, with apparently their assets have been frozen now. But I don't see that Abramovich is suffering too much, for example, as he floats around the world trying to bring about peace. And I think apparently his yachts have not been able to be moved. That sort of thing doesn't really affect them very much. And Putin, of course, is not in that position anyway, personally, and his immediate entourage. But as you say, what is really going to hit is not just the situation in Russia or in Ukraine for the ordinary person, not apart from the destruction of their homes, lives, and 3 or 4 million people left Ukraine now, and another 2 million displaced within the country. It's an absolute nightmare. But around the world, this is going to have a huge impact on working class people, particularly in the poor countries. As you say, Tina, the massive increase in grain prices, food prices have rocketed. The Food Agricultural Organization has an international price index. It is at the highest level ever in the history of the FAO index, which is an indication of the hit that is going to be taken in food prices. And of course, we know in energy prices. Here in the UK, we're really going to be hit and are being hit by huge energy prices. Just imagine what that means for other countries around the world who need food, and they import most of their food or their energy at the moment. They're going to be severely hit. I'm just preparing a little study on the number of countries that are facing basically bankruptcy in the next few months. They'll have to turn to, God help them, to the international agencies like the IMF or the World Bank to try and help them out, because there isn't anybody else. Chinese provide some support, but only limitedly. These countries are going to be bankrupt. People are going to suffer severe declines in their living standards. And they've already just spent a year being hit by the COVID pandemic, where took 150 million people out of work and a severe drop in living standards in many of the so-called emerging economies of the global south. These are the countries that are really facing the as you were, the fallout from this conflict. And the longer it goes on, and the longer there's no support internationally for these countries, apart from money with conditions from the IMF, the situation could not be worse. I cannot think of how, if you're an average person in a country like Ghana or Egypt or Turkey or elsewhere, the impact after the pandemic slump to have this follow up, it is just quite staggering. And there's really little or nothing being done internationally. The G20 will do nothing about this situation for all these countries.